Hi, yes. So this is really a truly extraordinary event. We've had lots of major heat waves in Europe, I'm sure, as you've probably reported on many times. It's getting quite common. But this one, even compared to those summer heat waves, is really extraordinary. Now, we don't usually think, for instance, of these winter heat waves maybe getting the news as much, but it's really in terms of how much of a deviation they are from the normal, it's extraordinary. So, for instance, as you mentioned, 7 countries, so it's very widespread across Europe. And for instance, in Warsaw, Poland, they broke their old record by over 5 degrees from what the previous warmest January temperature ever was. And so usually these records are broke by maybe a tenth of a degree or so. And so it's this huge amount. And this record was actually broken before sunrise. That's how warm it got. And in other places in France and Spain, they reach temperatures that are more common that they might see, for instance, in the middle of summer. So this would be kind of the same as if in the middle of July in Victoria, it was 25 to 27 degrees. And so it's really this huge difference that we're looking at and truly extraordinary in terms of what is normal and what we're seeing and what we saw in the past few days.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we know that sometimes Spain and countries further south get quite warm across winter, but countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, Denmark, further north, this is weather you probably see in summer if you're lucky.
Yes, exactly. I mean, they had some of the temperatures at night were well over 10 to 15 degrees in some of these countries, which is pretty warm even for July night in these places, which is another part, kind of another signal that we expect to see oftentimes from human-caused climate change is this increase in warm night temperatures. But even for that expectation, this was pretty extraordinary and very unprecedented in that case.
Yeah. So is there an explanation other than what, of course, most of us understand now? It is climate change and it is creating this rising temperature. But for that distinction, when you're talking about 5 degrees warmer, is there another factor?
Right. And so for many of these cases, even if we didn't have this kind of human amplification of the weather, we'd still be having these extreme events, warm periods, cold periods, and so on. So probably we can kind of imagine that this sort of event could have happened in the past without human interference, but it wouldn't have been quite to this degree. It would have been, record warm, but not pushed so much in this way. So this is kind of what we see is that we have this really strong weather setup, this heat dome over Europe, which is, we have these in winter. And the difference is kind of seems to be is that we're kind of pushing the gas with this human, input and this, the greenhouse gases and everything. And really pushing what might have been in the past just, a very warm winter day to these truly record-breaking conditions, just kind of adding gas to the fire that already would have existed in this case. And this is what really pushes it to these never before seen records. In one case, I think it was in Prague, it was their hottest January temperature. And they've had records that go back 250 years. So that really shows you, this isn't just us looking back 50 years, it's multiple centuries that we have data for.
That's incredible. What are the flow-on effects, Pete? I mean, we see the glaciers now increasingly melting. We saw no ski season, literally, for many parts that are normally blanketed in snow. What does that mean, though, more broadly for the planet?
Right. And so it's surely, this is a big economic hit for some of these places, especially in alpine areas. I've been checking some of the just kind of the ski resort cameras. And in many places in France, for instance, even at 2,000 meters, there's no snow. And these are areas that normally would have several meters of snow. But that is also a concern, people might appreciate, these warm winter, it's a little break from the energy costs of heating the homes. But ecologically and for the biosphere, this is quite severe. So if you're not building up that winter snowpack, this is going to cause problems in the summer. If we don't build that up before the summer season, you're going to have reduced hydropower, water sources for many of these regions that are dependent upon this alpine or winter snowpack in other areas. Ecologically, too, we really need these cold winter periods to really kind of take out pest areas or pest species. Invasive, insects for agriculture, all these things, we're used to having this winter punch of this freezing kills these off or reduces their numbers. And whenever you don't have that reduction, it can really throw these kind of ecosystems, both in agricultural areas and natural areas, quite out of sync and cause many problems down the road for other things, especially if we have another summer that's quite warm, hot, and dry like we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Contrast is the US, where they've seen record-breaking snowfalls. The scenes there were also quite extraordinary. Again, is this, just another unusual climate event, or is it, again, largely driven, do you think, by climate change and human impact?
Yes, so the U.S. event is kind of interesting because it is this nice contrast where we see a cold event, and it was quite extreme cold for the area. It was in many places the coldest Christmas since the 1980s. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that if we're kind of going back to that idea that normally we would have had these extreme events happening naturally, and we see this in the U.S. record one that while it was quite cold, it wasn't all-time cold records. And in many cases, this lasted, it was a brief cold spell, kind of something you might see once every few decades. And while it was extreme, it wasn't nearly this, extraordinary event like we're seeing in Europe, which is, again, what we kind of expect to see. We're still going to have cold periods even in a globally warmer world, but they're not going to be reaching those record-breaking levels quite as frequently. And in many of those cases, actually, the places that had that record-breaking cold in Christmas, by New Year's Day, they were setting heat records again. And so it wasn't a very lasting cold, had some severe impacts, but this is kind of, again, just it's not quite to that extreme degree that we see in these heat waves, which is a really common thing that we're seeing, that we're having these cold events, but they're not matching or exceeding the record cold of the past, but we're having these heat events that almost, every few months we're having somewhere around the globe, yet another unprecedented event, so it kind of tells that story quite well, I think.
Indeed. Pete, really good to have you on and to give us a sense, as you've pointed out, of some of those flow-on effects. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.